This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's time for another Deck History, the series where I discuss prominent deck archetypes from their origins all the way through to the current day. It's been about a month since the last Deck History as the series went on a short hiatus for the holidays, but I ran a poll a few weeks back about what the topic of the first Deck History of 2022 would be, and ultimately, Red Deck Wins came out on top. Red Deck Wins refers to what are usually mono red decks that run a lot of cheap and efficient creatures to pressure the opponent early, along with some burn spells to function as removal and reach. Red Deck Wins has a pretty long history, and it has a pretty viable claim as the most successful aggro deck of all time when we look at the history of Magic as a whole. Red Deck Wins and variants of it have found success in various block and standard formats, as well as modern, extended, and pioneer. And in this video, we'll take a look at the deck in each of these formats and how and why it changed over time. This video will look at things a bit more broadly than most in this series, since Red Deck Wins is a name that represents a whole lot of decks throughout Magic's history, and many of those decks don't have a single card in common apart from having mountains. So, to start, let's talk about the origins of Red Deck Wins. When I did a deck history on Burn a few months ago, we talked about it having its origins in a specific deck called Sly, which emerged in 1996. In that video, I called Sly the uncle of burn decks, and it has an even more direct lineage with Red Deck Wins, so I think we can call it the father of burn decks. Sly decks got their name from the player, Paul Sly, who found success with the deck in 1996. It was mono red and utilized a low curve and burn spells for reach. While that deck didn't emerge until 1996, there is one earlier deck I want to talk about that is often referred to as pre-Sly, as it's an earlier version of what Paul Sly would ultimately perfect. At Worlds in 1995, Eldraine Era reached the top 8 with what I think we can call the grandfather of Red Deck Wins. The deck runs a decent number of creatures, including low-curve ones like Goblin Balloon Brigade and Orcish Spy. It also ran a bunch of instants and sorceries that could hit creatures or players, most notably Lightning Bolt, Incinerate, and Fireball. Taken together, all of this meant that the opponent would take a lot of damage in a hurry. This was more of a burn deck than Red Deck Wins, with a large number of direct damage spells, but it was still a mono red deck with cheap creatures and burn for reach, so I think it warrants mentioning here. Now, let's fast forward a year and take a look at what Paul Sly did in 1996. While it sounds obvious to us these days, curving out with creatures wasn't something that most decks were doing in the early days of Magic, so this was actually a very big moment that really resulted in the birth of low-curve aggro decks. Even if we go back and look at Eldraine Era's pre-Sly deck, you'll see his creatures are sort of scattershot when it comes to mana value, so the deck really isn't about curving out. Paul's deck jammed in a whopping 24 creatures. For comparison, Eldraine Era's had 11. And while many of these creatures aren't impressive today, at the time, playing turn 1 Brassman, turn 2 Ironclaw Orc, and turn 3 Brothers of Fire was a pretty fast start, especially with burn around to get blockers out of the way. Brothers of Fire also represents something a lot of the creatures in the deck can do, and that's direct damage to the opponent. Ultimately, 3 different, long-lasting archetypes would branch off from this deck. The most obvious of these is the topic of this video, Red Deck Wins, which embraces the whole game plan of the deck even to this day. You want to play a lot of cheap red creatures to do damage early, use burn spells to get blockers out of the way, and or to finish off your opponent. The other 2 decks that would branch off would be Burn and Ponza. Because Ponza and Burn decks are related to Red Deck Wins, it's probably a good idea to briefly discuss the difference between each of them. The main difference between Red Deck Wins and Burn is that Burn decks run a lot fewer creatures. Again, Red Deck Wins is focused on curving out and attacking more than it is on casting burn spells, while Burn decks tend to play a couple creatures early and then cast burn spells for the rest of the game. Burn decks tend to run something like 10 to 12 creatures, and Red Deck Wins often packs in 20 plus. In short, Red Deck Wins is a creature-based deck that uses burn spells for reach, not a deck that plans to do the bulk of its damage with burn spells. There's also a third deck that branched off from this, and that's Ponza, which added land destruction to the strategy, and that's a deck I'll address in a different video at some point. So, when did Sly take on the name Red Deck Wins? Well, Standard was where the deck name first appeared, so we're going to start there. Because there are so many Red Deck Wins decks over the years, we aren't going to talk about every single one, but we will talk about the historically significant ones and the ones that were particularly dominant in their format. Let's start with a look at the first deck to actually use the name Red Deck Wins. At Worlds in 1997, 2 decks with the name managed to go undefeated on day 1. As you can see, this deck is very similar to what Paul Sly used a year earlier, but there are some differences that helped make the deck more aggressive. Chief among these is the inclusion of several haste creatures, something that Paul Sly had less access to in 1996, but there are also a few cards that were around earlier that weren't in Paul's deck, like Ball Lightning. This is part creature, part burn spell, and it could result in a ton of damage for the cost. Other hasty creatures in the deck included Lava Hounds, Sukata Lancer, and Viashino Sandstalker. Haste would of course go on to be a big part of most versions of Red deck wins. So would playing aggressive creatures with downsides like Lava Hounds or the Sandstalker. It turns out losing life or having to bounce something to your hand is well worth it if you're doing a ton of damage. In addition to those more aggressive creatures, the deck also, of course, utilized burn spells for reach. Lightning Bolt was no longer legal in Standard, but Incinerate was still around, and there were two other pretty nice burn spells in the deck. Fire Blast was a free one that could do damage out of nowhere, and Hammer of Bogarden was a nice recursive burn spell that gave the deck some inevitability. Red deck wins would next show up in Standard in 2001, when Michael Turian piloted his version of the deck to a top 8 finish at Worlds. While the names on almost all of the cards are different from Red deck wins of 1997, the game plan is pretty much the same, and that's sort of what we'll see throughout this video. It's still filled with a bunch of cheap aggressive creatures and burn spells. For example, Ball Lightning wasn't around in Standard, but Skizik was, and it did a pretty good impression of the older card. Another important inclusion in the deck was Flametongue Kavu, a card that was one of the best in Standard at the time, and while it didn't burn the opponent, the fact it could come down and kill a thing while adding to your board, and usually letting you attack with your other creatures, was quite powerful. Usually in this series, you try to stay in one format and discuss the deck in that format until the current day, or until the deck stopped being played, but there actually wouldn't be another successful Red deck wins deck in Standard for several years, so we're going to take a little break from Standard, and even go back in time a little bit to talk about Red deck wins in Tempest Block Constructed, and then we'll talk about the deck in Extended before returning to Standard. That might sound like a weird way to do things, but it will make sense, I promise. At Worlds in 1998, two Red Decks win decks finished in the top 8 of the block portion of the tournament, and despite only containing cards from Tempest Block, both of them used two cards that would go on to be part of Red Deck wins for several years. Turns out Tempest Block had some great creatures for the deck, in particular Jackal Pup and Mog Fanatic. Jackal Pup gave the deck a 1-mana 2/1, something that is necessary for most aggro decks to really succeed even today. And sure, it comes with a downside, but like we saw with Lava Hounds, who cares? You're going to kill them before it matters. Meanwhile, Mog Fanatic was a 1-drop which could give itself up to ping something, and it was even better then than it looks today, because when damage used the stack, you could use the Fanatic to do a total of 2 damage between the 1 combat damage and its sacrifice ability, which means it could do things like take down 2 X1s or a single X2, or just kill a single X1 and ping your opponent. So, yeah, this was a block deck, but Jackal Pup and Mog Fanatic would be important cards for Red deck wins for several more years, especially in Extended. See, there's that segue I was promising. We have to fast forward to 2002 to see the emergence of Red deck wins in Extended. If you don't know, Extended is a now defunct rotating format that featured the last few years of cards. In 2002, Alex Mack became the first to top 8 with Red deck wins in Extended, and he did it at Grand Prix Reims. And look at that, there's Jackal Pup and Mog Fanatic. In addition to those really nice 1-mana creatures, the deck also ran 4-ofs of 2 other 1-drops, Goblin Cadets and Grim Lavamancer. This means the deck had 16 1-drop creatures, which could allow it to very rapidly populate the board. The Pup and the Cadets are both 2/1s that come with a downside that shouldn't matter, and Grim Lavamancer provides some excellent late-game reach. Blistering Firecat was the only creature in the deck that didn't cost 1 mana, and it took up the Ball Lightning slot in the deck, and would often be capable of doing lethal on its own. Another important inclusion here was Cursed Scroll. The plan with the scroll was to use the ability when you only had 1 card in hand, so that it would always let you shock something, and that provided some excellent burn to help the deck close out the game. Over the next few years in Extended, the deck continued to find success, but it didn't change much, as there hadn't been a rotation. The one exception to this was the addition of Flametongue Kavu in some versions of the deck. However, by 2005, the deck underwent a very significant change. It stopped always being mono red, and Boros deck wins was born. In many ways, this deck was a fusion between White Weenie and Red deck wins. White Weenie isn't a deck I've covered in this series yet, but it's a mono-white aggro deck with a similar low-curve strategy to Red deck wins, so the two decks make sense to put together, especially because the deck had lost Jackal Pup, and Red no longer had such a good 1-mana 2-power creature in Extended. Boros deck wins got to run both Isamaru and Savannah Lions in this slot, both of which are just great vanilla creatures. The deck also got access to the powerful burn spell Lightning Helix, which was another great reason to go the Boros route. From this point forward in Extended, many versions went with both red and white, though mono red decks were still pretty common. Extended ended in 2011 after several years of fairly consistent success from red deck wins and Boros deck wins. Let's take a quick look at Legacy 2 before we return to Standard, because a Boros deck wins deck actually put up a top 8 there too, when Chris Bergeson piloted a version of the deck to a top 8 finish at the 2008 Legacy Championship. As you can see, despite the fact that Legacy had a much larger card pool, the deck was not that much different from what we just saw in Extended. One exception was Jotun Grunt, a card that is well positioned in formats with powerful graveyard decks. Since against those types of decks, the Grunt is just a super efficient creature that also hates on the graveyard, which is pretty great. This was really the only time that red deck wins put up a major finish in Legacy. Now, after this detour, let's return to Standard for a while, where we'll talk about some of the best red deck wins variants to emerge over the years. Red deck wins showed up in Standard in 2011 at Grand Prix Pittsburgh. By now, we're once again looking at an almost completely different list of cards, but the plan remains the same, of course. This Standard features some very powerful cards for the deck. One of the most notable is Goblin Guide, which gave the deck access to a 1-mana 2/2 with haste. A 1-drop with haste that comes with a downside is very much what red deck wins is about, and this is yet another one where you don't really care about the downside if you're playing the deck, because your opponent will be dead before they can ever take advantage of the extra cards they might draw. Notably, the fact it reveals the card isn't even always a downside, because you get information about what your opponent has in their deck. This was also a Standard format where Lightning Bolt was legal again, and that is pretty much the best burn spell ever, so that was great too. Another card I'd like to touch on here is Chandra's Phoenix, which gave you a hasty 2/2 flyer that comes back to your hand when you burn your opponent. Something else that is right up the alley of red deck wins. Let's jump now to the Standard of 2013, where Ari Lax piloted red deck wins to a top 8 finish at Grand Prix Atlantic City. As usual, the deck featured an impressive curve. The 1-drops here are particularly imposing. Rakdos Cackler gave the deck a creature that was usually a 1-mana 2/2, and Stromkirk Noble would get larger and larger if your opponent didn't deal with it. The deck also featured Hellrider, a card that's right at home in a deck like this. This deck is loaded up with 28 creatures, and most of them are cheap, so if you simply curve out with the deck up until turn 4, Hellrider comes down and will often give you lethal on the spot or very close to it. By 2014, Innistrad Block had rotated out of Standard, and that means Hellrider had too, but red deck wins continued to flourish. Denis Ulanov piloted the deck to a top 8 finish at Grand Prix Los Angeles that year, and it has one of the lowest curves we've seen so far, with only 17 lands in the deck. This gives you a lot more chances to draw cards that do stuff, and that's pretty much all you want to be doing after you get to 3 lands. One important inclusion here is Monastery Swiftspear, a 1-mana 1/2 with haste and prowess, and it quickly became a candidate for best red 1-drop of all time status. Like all versions of red deck wins, the deck runs a significant number of non-creature spells, so the Swiftspear is often hitting pretty hard and is very difficult to block. Another nice 1-drop for the deck was Foundry Street Denizen. Every single spell in the deck is red, so it's pretty much always attacking for 2 or more, and because the deck also ran some ways to go wide like a Crowan Crusader and Goblin Rabblemaster, it usually attacked even harder. In 2015, a new variant of red deck wins emerged, either called Gruul deck wins or Atarka Red. Magnus Lanto top-8'd the 2015 World Championship with the deck, which, obviously enough, was a Gruul deck. It was still mostly mono-red, but it added green to the mix for the powerful Atarka's Command. Most frequently, this would do 3 damage to the opponent and give +1/+1 to your whole board for 2 mana, and that's a great deal. You just end up doing a ton of damage for the amount of mana you're spending, especially because this deck was very much keyed towards going wide. In addition to the typical cheap and aggressive creature cards, the deck also uses Dragon Fodder and Hordling Outburst, which allow you to add to the board while also triggering prowess. This version of the deck was the most dominant one in 2015. 2017 would see the debut of what was arguably the most dominant version of red deck wins we've ever seen, Ramunap Red. What really helped push this deck over the top was the fact that it had lands that could do the last damage you needed to do in a game, in particular, Ramunap Ruins and Sun-Scorched Desert. That might not seem that impressive on the face of it, but being able to treat your lands as very real spells in your deck is a big deal, and meant that the deck had so many cards in it that did damage. Gone were the days of having to play a bunch of lands that just produce mana. Now you could finish off your opponent with your deserts. The deck also had access to some impressive creatures, of course. On-Crop Crasher and Earthshaker Kenra were hasty creatures that could keep people from blocking, and Hazaret the Fervent was one of the best top curves that any version of this deck has ever utilized, since it was both a huge indestructible creature and a source of more direct damage. The deck actually proved to be too good, and Ramunap Ruins was ultimately banned out of the format, so this deck would stop being so dominant. Red Deck Wins would continue to find success throughout 2018, but not at the same level it had before getting banned. However, by 2019, Red Deck Wins was back as one of the best decks in the format. One of the biggest reasons for this was Torbrand, Thane of Redfell. He made all of your red sources of damage do even more damage, so he gave a deck a great 4-drop that drastically boosted the amount of damage you could do right when you played him. Runaway Steamkin was another great payoff for playing a bunch of red cards because it would get larger and could even produce mana if you wanted it to. Another great feature for the deck was the adventure mechanic, which appeared on both Bone Crusher Giant and Rimrock Knight. Aggro decks like cheap removal and pump spells, and these two also happen to be creatures who attack pretty hard. Going into 2020, the deck got even better. Probably the biggest addition was Embercleave. It's pretty crazy, but earlier decks like Li Shi Tian's we just looked at didn't actually run the Cleave, even though Throne of Eldraine was around, but by 2020 it was clear that you needed to be making use of this crazy powerful equipment. Embercleave could turn a whole lot of attacks into lethal ones out of nowhere, or completely obliterate an opposing blocker while also doing damage to the opponent. Additionally, Anax, hardened in the Forge, provided you with a payoff for playing a bunch of red cards, and it also happened to be a pretty good place to put Embercleave, since it instantly raised your devotion, in addition to the boosts normally granted by the Cleave. Frequently, those two together felt like an instant win combo. Now we're moving into just last year, 2021, where Red Deck Wins continued to thrive, now taking on a snow sub-theme as a result of some important cards that were printed in Kaldheim. The biggest reason Snow was important in this version of Red Deck Wins was Faceless Haven. This is an aggressively statted creature land that is very good in aggro decks. Kind of like with Ramunap Ruins, which we saw earlier, having your lands do something other than just be lands is a huge deal, and having a land that can become a 4/3 is definitely no joke. It can really close out games. It even gives you a sort of backup plan if your opponent uses a board sweeper. The deck also took advantage of Frostbite, which typically did 3 damage in this deck. By the end of 2021, Embercleave and the adventure creatures had rotated out of Standard, and we haven't really seen Red Deck Wins find any significant success since then. And right now, at least, it isn't really a major deck in the metagame. So, that's the long and varied history of Red Deck Wins in Standard. We still have one more format to talk about though, Pioneer, though its history is much more succinct. Also, you might be thinking that Red Deck Wins is a thing in Modern, and I should be talking about it, but in that format it's used pretty interchangeably with Burn. As you can see from this deck that Brendan Regenbald top-8'd Grand Prix Pittsburgh with in 2015, it only runs 12 creatures and a massive pile of burn spells. This isn't really Red Deck Wins at all, and that's true of other decks bearing the name in the format too. Anyway, on to Pioneer. Pioneer, by the way, is a non-rotating format that features all cards dating back to Return to Ravnica, so it has a much larger card pool than Standard, and the Red Deck Wins variants in the format basically utilize the best cards out of many of the Standard decks we've already talked about. This includes utilizing Ramunap Ruins, Torbrand, Thane of Redfell, Monastery Swiftspear, and Bone Crusher Giants all in the same deck, which makes it pretty impressive. The deck hasn't changed a whole lot since Juan Jose Rodriguez Lopez top-8'd Pro Tour Brussels with it, and it continues to be a major deck in the format. Red Deck Wins is also kind of a thing in Historic, but because it hasn't managed to top 8 at a major event there or even gotten close, I won't be covering it here. So that's the history of Red Deck Wins. It has been a pretty consistent presence in Magic since the mid-90s. It is a tried and true strategy that can find its place in many different Standard formats. If you want to have a say in the next episode of Deck History, don't forget to vote on the Community tab. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future editions of this series, subscribe and turn on notifications, and you'll stay aware of new content. If you want to catch up on the other 24 deck histories, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.